Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Professor Randy Bartlett, a professor of economics at Smith College since 1979. Randy, real honor to have you.
Well, thanks, Doug. It's a real pleasure for me to have an opportunity to do this.
So through the Great Courses, this fabulous teaching company, you teach a course on thinking like an economist and applying that kind of rational thinking to life. My experience is that life really isn't that rational. How do you build that in?
Well, one of the things about economics and rationality is that when we talk about it, we're really talking about the means that people use rather than the ends that they try to achieve. So if you had what to me would be a totally irrational passion for trying to summit every peak on the highest peak on every continent in the world, to me that would be a crazy objective. But if it meant something to you, economists talk about rationality then as taking strategic steps to try and accomplish that. And so when you had an opportunity to further that goal, you would take it. And so my wife, for example, would think taking a rock climbing course would be just absurd. But if you had that objective, which is somewhat sentimental in emotion, an economist would say that's perfectly rational for you to do and irrational for her.
Okay, so let's focus that on my day job. If you don't mind, I'm going to get advice from you for how to help my clients. In real life, I'm an investment advisor.
Okay.
I only do the radio gig once a week, so I have this great opportunity to speak to people about their money. And
yes.
As you may imagine, this is oftentimes one of the most irrational
yes.
discussions you can have. But based on what you're saying, if someone tells me, Doug, I want to buy a Ferrari, and I know he can't afford it, but he really wants it, is that rational?
No, the rationality then has to come when you compare that end with the possible means. And so I think you have to fundamentally tell him, here's what's available to you. And the other thing that economics is all about is the trade-offs. If you do the Ferrari, you will not be able to survive retirement. If you do the Ferrari, you'll have to sell your house. That in a sense, to bring reality and information to it is rational. But the fact that he loves Ferraris, that's an emotional thing. And I certainly can't say he shouldn't love Ferraris. But to bring the possibilities, the attainability of that goal into clear light is probably what your role is.
Yeah, as an example, I'll tell you, my office is based in Jerusalem, and I met recently with a couple who had a lovely house in the suburbs, and they always wanted to live in Jerusalem near the old city and the Western Wall, and they couldn't afford it.
Sure.
But they really wanted it, so I said, listen, why don't we choose a period of time, and we worked out the plan where they could rent an apartment for a few years.
Okay.
And that would help them to achieve their dream in a rational way. So
sure.
I was applying the precept.
And that is absolutely rational, that it's not rational to try and attain things that are really beyond your means, but it is rational to try and find the best possible way to get close to what you want. That's what rationality is really about.
Unfortunately, one of the problems is trying to explain anything rational to someone who has an emotional connection to it.
Of course.
Could be impossible, but you teach about thinking like an economist. So how do you teach that?
Well, some of it is just to have some awareness of a couple things. So if there's anything that's fundamental to economists, it's that they think people respond to incentives. And so it's not just looking at your own incentives, but looking at the incentives you create for other people as you interact with them. And so an example of where somebody did not think like an economist was in the old Soviet Union. And I'm sure everybody remembers the great pole vaulter Sergei Bubka. Nobody will, of course. But in 1986, he first set a pole vault record, and then in the next 10 years sent 35 more world records for the pole vault. But each one was only a tiny fraction of a centimeter higher than the last one. And it turns out that the Soviet government at that time was providing a large cash bonus to any of their athletes that broke a world's record. And Sergei took this to heart and said his goal then was not to raise it by the highest amount he could, but raise it as often as he could. So he then changed his whole strategy of how he was going to compete, constantly push the pole vault record up by the tiniest fraction and get a large bonus each and every time. And another way you can think about, the people responding to incentives is I had a friend whose daughter went to her first year of college and then sent home a bill for $2,000 for textbooks.
Wow.
And the mother, of course, was horrified. But she was an economist, so the next semester what she did is she sent her daughter $500 to pay for books and told her she could keep anything that was left over. And at that point, the daughter had a great incentive to use textbooks or go to the library and use the reserve room. And it was just a recognition that you're responding, creating incentives for other people and anticipating how they're going to respond to them. And that's part of what thinking like an economist is.
All right, good for her. Very, very smart solution. We're talking with Professor Randy Bartlett, a professor of economics at Smith College. So let me focus on this a little bit more. You're talking about the incentives. We had the opportunity on the Goldstein on Gelt show a while back to speak to Dan Ariely, who is known as...
I've met him, but I know his work, yeah.
Yeah, a character, to say the least. He's written a number of books about irrationality.
Yep.
By the way, for people who want to hear that interview, just go to YouTube and look up Dan Ariely and Goldstein on Gelt, and you can hear that. One of the things Dan has, in fact, told me personally was a test that he had done where they laid out that people could buy a gift certificate for $20, a $20 gift certificate, and they'd only pay $7 for it.
Yeah.
Or they could get a $10 gift certificate for free. Right, so the first model is they're net. They're getting $13, but the second model is they get $10 for free. So do you want to guess which one they chose?
The 10 for free, probably.
Right, exactly. So how does that fit into your thinking here?
That's one of those puzzles, and of course, what Dan is doing is a whole new field of behavioral economics, where they find in sort of psychological experiments that people don't behave as rationally as we would like them to, or at least as we anticipate in our models that they're going to. And that's just one of those things where physicists spend a lot of time talking about frictionless models and what would happen in a world without friction, and economists often spend time talking about what would happen if everybody was perfectly rational. But I think we all recognize that in the real world there are these deviations from rationality that are kind of hard to fit into our models.
Okay, so that's what the behavioral finance guys study. We see that a lot on Wall Street because investors are traditionally irrational. They make all sorts of strange decisions. So you've been an economist for a long time, and it seems that there's been changes in the world. And in fact, I was just reading an article that in Japan, they're having a terrible problem because they don't procreate enough. People aren't marrying because they actually say it's just bad for their careers. Are people thinking today much more in economic terms than perhaps in previous generations where family might have seemed important?
That's hard to say, and certainly there's a lot of debate in economics about what people are doing. And of course, a lot of the models and the theory says people don't have to consciously be thinking rationally, but they tend to do it. So again, with the question of, for example, procreation, I mean, there's a lot of theories and some evidence that says that one of the reasons why when economic development takes place and average income rises, the number of children people have goes down. And the economic argument for that is that the children in that sense become more expensive individually. And so you invest in, and I don't like this term, quality of children rather than quantity of children, but you have fewer kids because you want to be able to send them to college because it takes a lot more to educate them and take care of them in a more expensive world. And I don't think people sit around and consciously do that. I don't think many people say, what's the marginal cost and marginal benefit of another child? And it certainly would not be a very romantic relationship if they did. But I think they act as if they do. So I think people have always responded to kind of the incentives that were available to them, whether they were doing it in a careful, thoughtful fashion or just doing it sort of haphazardly.
I mean, we see that a lot in the way the government will work with people. They'll set up tax incentives or penalties if you, for example, either sign up for this or don't sign up for that. So they can definitely guide the masses that way.
Yep.
Not terribly emotional. Do you think that in the world of economic thinking, there is room for feelings and emotion?
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm an economist. I live in the world. I do kind of careful modeling when I deal with economic issues. But when I sit around and watch my grandchildren play, that is the richness in life. It's so much more important than checking my portfolio or anything. That economics is a side of life, but it certainly isn't life, at least in the way I live it.
Okay, so it's the side of economics that we're talking about is used for measuring things. And I'll sort of wrap up with this question, which is one of the things I've noticed about economists is I find it funny when I get clients who are economists, and they'll tell me. I always figure, well, you know much more than I do. You got the PhD. You're writing papers all the time, and they say, "Yeah, Doug, but you take care of the money." What does an economist really do if he's not dealing with money?
Well, it's an interesting question because economists tend to think they deal with everything. And the first thing, when a student takes their first economics course, they think that's what it's going to be. They think it's going to be about money and stocks and bonds and all that. But that's really very peripheral. It's a social science, and the social science is really trying to understand the broader institutions by which every society has to balance off scarcity of wants and unlimited needs. And so a lot of what we're dealing with is social questions of what kind of a policy would efficiently deal with inflation, or how do you control congestion on highways and things along those lines. And so it's not so much about how I get rich, it's how the society as a whole is functioning to try and improve the quality of material existence.
Okay, so that's actually a very good explanation. I think we've certainly seen that with even the economists we've had on the Goldstein on Gelt show, many of whom don't really necessarily talk about money issues, but they talk about other tests they have, from putting kids, the decision-making of how kids get chosen for college, which was a topic of a Nobel Prize, or the way organs are donated.
Sure.
Randy, we're just about out of time, I see. We've been talking to Professor Randy Bartlett from Smith College. In the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people follow your work?
Well, I think with the kind of things we've been talking about, I do have this course on the great series called How to Think Like an Economist, a Guide to Rational Decision Making. And that's where I discuss this kind of stuff more. In my more formal professional life, I tend to do more esoteric stuff on urban economics that probably isn't as interesting to a broad audience. So I would recommend that as a way to hear more about the kind of things we've discussed, Doug.
Okay, that sounds great. What we'll do is we'll put a link to your course on the great courses at the show notes of goldsteinongelt.com. Randy, thanks again so much for your time.
My absolute pleasure, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.